I'm Stephen Pagnani, Head of Marketing here at the Institute of Science. Before we begin, I have to give two thanks. Thanks to Michigan Radio for helping us sponsor this event and getting the word out. We appreciate it. And thank you to all of you for once again battling the weather to join us tonight. Our next lecture is March 20th, which is the first day of spring. I'm making no promises. We're all going to cross our fingers. I won't say it won't be worse. You never know this year. So I appreciate you coming. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Scott Sowa back. For those of you who may have attended last year, Scott discussed the Great Lakes as centers of commerce, culture, and conservation. Scott provides scientific leadership and advice to Conservancy and its partnership to help implement system-level aquatic conservation strategies throughout the Great Lakes. Tonight, he will present Get With the Program, How Technology is Advancing Conservation. Should be very interesting the way technology is taking over our lives. At least it's good to see sometimes it's in a good way. Since joining the Nature Conservancy in 2008, Scott has been involved in projects with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Michigan State University, designed to develop decision tools that will help prioritize watershed and agricultural conservation practices and predict which actions will have the highest ecological return on investment. He provides technical and scientific support for inland and coastal conservation and restoration programs and establishes research programs to develop essential data and knowledge and test new restoration techniques. A major focus of Scott's work has been improving information delivery. Scott has a bachelor's in fisheries and wildlife from Michigan State University and a master's and doctorate in fisheries and wildlife from the University of Missouri. Scott, welcome.
Well, thank you, Steve. And I want to echo what Steve said. Thanks for braving the elements. When I gave my talk here last year, it was a polar vortex. Now I know what that term means, but so I think I bring this baggage of bad weather with me. So beware if I'm on the docket, if we do this next year, it might be a crapshoot as to whether or not you want to attend because it might be bad weather. But I am delighted for being here, and I also want to thank Cranbrook for this excellent partnership that we've established with this lecture series. It is a pleasure and an honor to share our work with you, share our knowledge, our passion with all of you, in the hopes that if we can reach one person through that work, it's a good thing. I also want to echo the thanks given to Michigan Radio for supporting this lecture series this year. Initially, when we were planning this lecture series for this go-around, we talked about what could be a topic for me to talk about, and I thought, well, technology, the role technology plays in conservation. I thought, that's going to be a piece of cake. I've been in conservation now for about 25 years, and I've spent the vast majority of that looking for innovative ways to apply technology to improve how we do conservation. But the ease of putting this talk together couldn't have been further from the truth. All of that technology was basically I took for granted, and as I started to peel back the layers of the onion, so to speak, I realized I was ignorant of just how many different ways that technology has permeated both conservation science and the practical application of conservation out there on the ground. And so with that, I'm kind of taking a humble approach to this presentation and talking about technology in its broadest sense. I'm taking a multi-tiered approach. What is technology? I had to actually take a step back and ask that question of myself and see if I actually knew the answer. And then more specifically, what are the roles that technology can play in conservation or has played? And then I cherry-picked what I think are I know are some of the technologies that have truly revolutionized the practice of conservation. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of my time on that particular aspect because it's exciting to me, but it's also important, I think, for everyone to understand the tools of our trade, particularly those revolutionary tools that we use day in and day out to advance our conservation. And lastly, I'm going to take a bit of a deeper dive into how we at TNC in Michigan and in the Great Lakes are using these technologies in an integrated way to support our conservation strategies to help protect and restore the Great Lakes themselves, the rivers that feed them, and the lands upon which all of us depend. So with that, what is technology? I thought I knew, but we hear this word all the time, right? Technology. And so I really never gave the definition of technology much thought. It's one of those things, you know it when you see it, right? And as this timeline suggests, technology, it's not just, we often think about it as computer technology. That's the thing that, you know, it's at the forefront. The cell phones, the computers we use, the tablets, whatnot. But technology is actually a lot broader. And it's a two-pronged definition of what technology is. It's actually the use of scientific knowledge to help solve practical problems. Okay, so that's one aspect of it. But it can't be divorced from the fact that technology is also the specific methodologies, the materials, and the more common thing we think about, the devices that we use to solve those practical problems. Another definition that I saw that I actually liked better, but didn't have the two parts, it's the practical application of science. So with that, it's a very broad field. We all know that. And as I said, we often think of it as computer technology, but these are the major types of technology that touch all of our lives and touch us in conservation and how we do our work. We got computer technology, related information technologies, they're not the same thing. Electrical, mechanical, material, chemical, engineering, you know, those are the more common thing. It's the engineers of the world. Also genetics. And then more importantly, you're gonna see, rarely are these things used, these technologies used in isolation. They're actually integrated to create the tools that we use day in and day out. And what's interesting is that when I try, everyone who knows me knows I'm this very logical person. I've got to put things in nice categories and logically organize them. I couldn't do that with technology beyond these basic categories because every sector has their own box. So we have the medical sector, the transportation technology sector, the agricultural technology sector, the aerospace technology sector. But what's interesting is there is no conservation technology sector. And I step back and, you know, you can search on the web conservation technology and you'll find things here and there, but there's nothing that explicitly recognizes it as a subdiscipline like these others. And it makes sense because in reality, we borrow from all of these other sectors. Literally every single one of them. I can talk about things we take from the medical profession, from the transportation industry, certainly the ag industry, and a ton from the aerospace technology industry, which I'll get into a little bit later. Okay? So, we know what technology is, but how do we actually use it in conservation? And I want to spend a little bit of time on this slide because it's very important. It really does three things for us, okay? Technology gives us a better understanding of the complex systems that we work in, okay? And the interrelated socioeconomic systems. We are all part of nature. And we're learning more and more, particularly at the Nature Conservancy, we can't divorce ourselves from that fact. In fact, we have to emphasize more now than ever how humans interact and benefit from that interaction with nature. Okay? And through that better understanding, we're able to make better decisions on where we work and how we work. Boils down to better planning, better strategies. Technology, also in terms of the engineering side of things, is it provides more effective and efficient conservation actions. And why is that so important? Well, it stretches our dollar, right? Maximizes that return on investment. So when technology creates efficiencies for us, our dollar, and we have very limited resources in conservation, is stretched even further. And finally, it provides us a means of more effective communication. We can't do this alone, right? We're all part of conservation. You, me, all of our partners that we work with. And so that communication, a more effective communication, fosters a better common understanding among all of us, which leads to shared goals and leads to collaboration. Okay? And collectively, that means it translates into a better future for all of us, for nature and people. But what's interesting, there's a bit of irony here. A good part of conservation is about protecting places and restoring places where people go to escape the trappings of technology, right? Like Kitty Todd Preserve or St. Martin down in Ohio, which is part of the Oak Openings, or the recently acquired St. Martin's Island in Green Bay, or Grand River Fen, which is not far from here, Pictured Rocks, Black River Cove, Erie Marsh, and all of these are our Two-Hearted Forest Preserve up in the UP. And here's this fisherman up there. Do you think that fisherman wants a cell phone to ring while he's wetting that fly? No. So there is a bit of irony here, but the amount of technology that went into the protection and restoration and continues to go into the restoration of those is staggering. Staggering, even to me. So there is a bit of irony here. So I'm going to go through, uh-oh, it's cutting off the bottom of my slides. I hope that doesn't hurt too many of my slides. Anyway, I cherry-picked some of the technologies that have truly revolutionized technology, or truly revolutionized conservation. And I'm going to walk through these one by one. Obviously, computer technology, sensors, I'll get into, geographic information systems. Some of these may not be familiar to you, but hopefully they will be by the end of my talk. Computer modeling, mechanical, electrical, and chemical engineering, and what was the last one? Communication and information. So I apologize. The irony was the IT guy that works here is on vacation. And when set up, the guy that runs the front desk was the one that was put in charge of doing the IT stuff here, and we had technical difficulties. So, and it's playing out another bit of irony. Anyway. So, computer technologies, I don't need to go into this. So this is the bedrock. It's the technology that has transformed the world. And it's transformed all the other things that are on that list, that previous list. But two main things: the advancements in data storage, okay, the amount of data a computer can hold, and data processing, the speed at which it can process data, has fundamentally changed conservation. We work in the most complex systems in the world. It is a data-hungry and analysis-hungry profession, okay? And so for us, any advancement in these two categories is critical, okay? And we've gone from the days, I remember working on punch cards. Can anyone remember punch card days? I bought my first computer in 1990. It looked a lot like this. It was $1,200. $1,200. It had a 40 megabyte hard drive. This talk I'm giving to you right now is 47 megabytes. My talk could not fit on my old computer that I used in graduate school. This little SD card is 40 gigabytes. It's the size of a quarter. That's 1,000 times the storage capacity of my original computer in 1990. Okay? That's staggering. My computer was 8 megabytes of RAM. Okay? That's thinking about at the age of a 18-month-old individual. Now, we have the fastest computer in our office right now is 8 gigabytes of RAM. Okay? That's 1,000 times more processing speed than my original computer. The fastest computer right now in the world processes 5 petabytes of information every second. That's 1 million times faster than our fastest computer in our office. That's staggering, and I'll show you a little bit later how that is actually transforming our ability to do conservation at very large scales. Okay? Whoops, go back. So, sensors. I'm going to spend the brunt of my time on sensors. We're sensor happy, all right, in conservation. And in particular, two types of sensors, remote sensing and global positioning satellites, or GPS systems. I know everyone out here is familiar with those. I'm going to spend a lot of time on those because they have truly, truly revolutionized conservation. Okay? So what is a sensor? Sensor is simply a device that measures location, time, an amount of a physical, chemical, or biological property. Oh man, it is really messing up my slides. That is not good. So what does it allow us to do? It allows us to measure more things at more places. It allows us to measure them more accurately, precisely, and efficiently. Okay? What's funny is in my college days, we all joked in my fisheries and wildlife programs, whether it was at Michigan State or University of Missouri, man, if we only had a tricorder, we'd be out in the field and you're having to take these measuring tapes and pull them across streams that have snakes swimming in them and beavers shooting out from undercut banks with you, and then we'd look at each other and, man, if we only had a tricorder. Does everyone know what a tricorder is? Star Trek? The tri stands for the three principal things it could measure and analyze anything: geological, meteorological, and biological. And so Spock or Captain Kirk would pull out the tricorder and say, oh, and it'd measure anything you wanted. So that's why we always wanted a tricorder. But the reality is sensors allow us to move from, we've all done this, right? Oh, now that's run out of battery. Isn't this great? Help! I'm going to use my other laser. But putting our finger to the wind or our toe in the water, that's not very accurate to measure things, right? So now we have these devices, this anemometer, that we can actually hook them to our phone. We can put them in Antarctica. We can put them everywhere and measure and collect data very accurately, precisely about the habitats of the world, okay? The problem is, that's why I pause. There are so many things to measure. There's literally millions and millions of things that you can measure about the planet, right? The environment and people. We have to measure all, things about the land, the air, the water, the soil, the plants, the animals, people, their values, their activities, their health, their well-being. This is just a list from EPA of major categories of environmental variables with examples. I don't expect you to read this, but this is a tiny, tiny list. USGS has a book of standards that it's about yay thick of all the different things that we measure about the environment. I mean, it would break your foot if you dropped it on it, okay? So the problem is we have to be very cautious between how much do we invest in creating new sensors so that we can measure things a little more precisely, a little more accurately, a few more places, versus actually taking those investments and putting them on the ground in conservation. And that's a great thing about what we do at TNC, and I'm going to hammer this point home. Strategies first, technology second, all right? So I can't go into all the different sensors. I can't even count how many different sensors we use in our profession. But I'm going to go through a few. And right now I'm on sensors for air, water, and soil. And what these do is they allow us to measure the status and trends in environmental or habitat conditions over time and space. So we have big, clunky, EPA has these air sensors all over the United States. But we also have little portable devices. Okay. We also have devices that we can put in the soil that measure soil moisture, soil chemistry. We have these hydrolabs. We work with Notre Dame on several projects where we use these hydrolabs, and these things at the end are sensors, and you can interchange the different sensors. They can measure phosphorus, they can measure nitrogen, they can measure sediment, dissolved oxygen, and record it and download it, and you can measure it over time. Okay, this is concentrations of phosphorus in the Maumee River, which is a tributary to Lake Erie, over time, on a daily time step. Okay? But what we can also do now, this is what we have through the GLOSS, the Great Lakes Observing System. We have buoys out in the middle of the lakes and in the coastal areas that have sensors that are measuring all kinds of things: waves, temperatures, dissolved oxygen, nutrients, etc. And I apologize, because all the lakes are ice covered right now. I had to go back and get a historical representation, but this is a boater's forecast. You can go get a boater's forecast, and this talks about basically red. I would not go and take my boat there. If it's dark blue, it's okay. So you can see on this particular day, it was a good day to go boating on Lake Huron. But anyway, good data, and we can use this information as well, not just for boaters, but for environmental assessment too. So that's air, water, and soil. But we're in the business of conserving biodiversity, right? So we spend a lot of time and effort on sensors for animals, because animals are tricky, they move. And because they move, we got to find out better and better ways of tracking their movements so that we can monitor their habitat use and ultimately estimate their population size. Are they doing good, fair, poorly? So what we have are radio transmitters, PIT tags, which are passive integrated transponders, and we can use things like radio telemetry, which uses the principle of triangulation to find those little critters. Okay? Or we actually sometimes have to capture them and use sensors to count. It's the same principle as any of you have a dog. My dog, we had the little tag put in their neck so that, and then they have a dog tag. If she gets lost, they can recover her and find out who her owner is and where. But what's interesting is when I first got in this profession, these poor little birds, those transponders, and radio transmitters were huge. And I had partners, I'd go out in the field, we were putting them on rough grouse, we were putting them on quail. And those poor little buggers would walk around like, oh, I can't, what the heck is on my back? Well, of course, we shrunk them and shrunk them and shrunk them and shrunk them. Technological advancements led to the shrinking of this technology. So now we have these little tiny pit tags we can put in teeny tiny fish and track them all over. And look at this. They're so light and small now, we can put them on insects like dragonflies and track them, okay? What's interesting though is you gotta go find those little buggers. I'm gonna talk about a technology later that actually integrates another technology, global positioning system, so that you can do it remotely from your desktop. You guys can go online and actually track animals as we speak. Here's an important thing you need to know about though that's going on right now in the Great Lakes. It's the GLADOS. Okay, the Great Lakes Acoustic Telemetry Observation System. It's the first study of its kind to actually assess the movements of walleye, lake trout, and so these are actually points where these different sensors are anchored to the bottom. And so you have these tags on these fish, and as they swim around, they're tracking their movements, they're estimating their habitat use, and estimating their population size. You would think in this day and age we knew a lot about walleye, right? The premier sport fish in Saginaw Bay, Western Lake Erie. But what was interesting, just last year or the year before, they thought most of the walleye that actually spawned and were produced in Saginaw Bay kind of stayed there. They were homebodies. Well, what they found out through this ability of this technology is that over 50% of them actually go out into the main lake for most of the year. Now you say, well, who cares about that? It's very important in terms of setting harvest limits, in terms of stocking limits, all kinds of things for conservation. Okay. Here's ramping up the technology just a bit more. This is a technology our scientist Dave Ewart uses to track neotropical migrant birds like our very own Kirtland's warbler. Here's an example of a painted bunting, and these are called geolocators. This is really cool. So you have radio transmitters, right, that you have to go and track, but what a geolocator does, it actually measures sunrise, sunset, angle of sun every day. And so what you do, you still have to catch the bird, but you can download the data and you can track that bird's every movement from the Bahamas all the way up to where it breeds here in northern Michigan. You can track it. Pretty cool. Okay, well this is weird too. Boy, don't you love technology. Now, I'm going to talk about a very, very, very important sensor, remote sensing. This is very simple. Remote sensing is simply gathering information about an object or phenomena without ever coming into contact with it. Okay? It's been around since 1839, when a person in England leaned out the window with a camera and took a picture. That was the first ever. But the first truly ever remote sensing image was taken by this bird, a messenger pigeon, over London. That's the first image. Okay? Then we had planes come into existence. And during World War I and World War II, what did we have? People taking pictures from airplanes. Germany took over 15 million pictures during World War II. Europe took over 2 million. to spy on respective, and there's an example of one of those spy plane missions. Anyone know who this guy is? Probably not. Dr. Robert Goddard from the Goddard Flight Station, Flight Institute, the first rocket, okay? He sent up the first rocket ever in 1929, and then his second rocket he attached a camera to, okay? Well, he got this picture, okay, and this was in Massachusetts. After that rocket came down, the fire marshal from the local district came over and said, "What on earth are you doing?" Well, little did he know he would become one of the world's most preeminent aerospace engineers, rocket scientists. Okay. But then, in 1972, was a photo that changed it all. This was from the Apollo 17 mission. Okay. This is the photo that coined the term the blue marble or the blue planet. And after this photo, the rush to put satellites in orbit to take pictures of our Earth just exploded, okay? And so now what you have is remote sensing explosion. We have so much data, we don't know what to do with it. But remote sensing is usually done from airplanes, boats, ships, and satellites, okay? Here we have dozens and dozens. This shows global satellites. These are just the satellites we own, the NASA Earth Observatory satellites. And in conservation, we use pretty much every single one of these satellites, capturing imagery of our planet in new and spectacular ways. And I want to go through this because there's two very important distinctions. There's passive and active. Sounds, yeah, what the heck is that? Passive is merely where you're letting the sun do the work for you. The sun emits solar radiation, right? And everything reflects. One thing I learned in college in Michigan State is there's no such thing as color. Dr. Richard Hill, I took an animal physiology course, and I'm like, what do you mean there's no such thing as color? Because there's no such thing as color. And he goes over and he shuts all the drapes and he turns off the lights. He goes, you see any color? No. It's dark. He goes, exactly. There's no such thing as color. Color is merely the reflectance of light back at you, okay? And it's something hard to grasp, but it truly is amazing is that we have satellites up there by the dozens that measure the reflectance of the sun. And from that reflectance, each thing, we all know that snow has a different reflectance than a dark surface, right? A light-colored surface. It's because one absorbs more than the other. Same principle. But what's interesting is that satellites that we have up there they can measure everything from the ultraviolet to the infrared and everything in between. And for some reason, most people I talk to today seem to think there's 50 shades of gray. I don't know why. But in reality, there's about 1 million times more shades of gray. In fact, there's 256 grayscales. You ever print something out in grayscale instead of color on your printer? And they give you one set grayscale? There's actually 256. And then within each one of those, there's over 16,000 intensities of hues. 16,000. So that ends up to be about 4.6 million different shades of gray, if you will. And what this does is, here's a picture of Wisconsin. I don't know where in Wisconsin, but it's just one little scene. It might be the size of Bloomfield Hills, but you're looking at it at different spectral signatures along this visible spectrum. And what you can see is different patterns emerge under different spectrums. And we use this all the time because pattern recognition is critical to conservation in order for us to identify distinct habitat features of the Earth. Okay? And so what it's done, it's truly unveiled new patterns. Those new patterns have unveiled new relationships, which have advanced our knowledge exponentially, which now inform our conservation actions. But it's also an amazingly beautiful discipline. I've been fortunate enough to work with some of the greatest remote sensing specialists, and the images that I saw in my last job was just breathtaking. This is an image of the Mississippi River, okay, just before it comes into Louisiana. This is an image of the Ganges River Delta. showing different sediment plumes, different types of sediments going into the Bay of Bengal. Okay. This is a phytoplankton bloom in the South Atlantic, seen from a satellite. These are phytoplankton blooms seen off of Gotland Island, which is an island off of Sweden. What does this look like to you? Yep, exactly. That's what I thought. Isn't that beautiful? Absolutely beautiful. But what's interesting is the satellite, this is also giving us the ability to see a 30,000-foot perspective of our handiwork on the planet. Anyone know what this is? Or where this is? Yep. Everyone knows where that is. But I thought this was fascinating. So you see the Aurora Borealis, and here's the actual wing of the satellite. But that's pretty staggering, our footprint, isn't it? That's crazy. But anyway, entirely new perspective. Now, that's all passive remote sensing, where the sun's doing the work for us, right? Now active. So what is active? Very simple. We send a signal. We build a device that sends a signal, and then what we do is measure that return signal in terms of the timing of it, the direction and angle of it, the scattering of it, and we've heard of these all the time. Our weathermen and weather people say it all the time. Radar, which uses radio waves, sonar, which uses sound waves, and then LiDAR, which uses light and laser waves. It was so interesting, I was telling everyone, my son, he's in 3rd grade, but he's just a science aficionado. And yesterday I was talking about my talk to him as I'm driving him to school. And I got onto the topic of LiDAR and how it measures the topography of the land and whatnot. And he goes, "Hey, Dad," he raises his hand. He's in the back seat, I'm looking in the mirror, and I'm like, "Hey, yeah, Lucas, what's that?" And he goes, "Dad, you know what you need? You know what you need for this? Is to look at those data, you need a 3-dimensional computer model." I'm like, wow, that kid's smart. He was right. But what this technology does is gives us a 3-dimensional picture of our world, okay? And this is more specifically what it does. Just an example of LiDAR, and it allows us to see forests of the world in a whole new way. So from a plane, what it does is we can shoot lasers, and it gives us different return signals. The first thing it bumps into, we can measure. The next thing it bumps into, the third, the fourth, et cetera. And we can turn this data on its side and look and actually say, you know, that's a conifer forest. It's not a deciduous tree. But we can actually then step back, and this is in northern Michigan, and we can measure canopy height. We can look at the structure of these trees and actually assess what type of forest it is. It's pretty amazing technology, used all the time. It's even more amazing. The people who work with this data all the time are constantly amazed by the power of it. This is a LiDAR image that captured an African elephant on the African savanna. Isn't that beautiful? It's hard to believe. But what we can do is integrate those passive and active technologies and get even more beautiful pictures. Here's the Colorado River in Utah, 3-dimensional, and here's Mount St. Helens in 3 dimensions. And so some people, as I said, see remote sensing as an art. I do as well. In fact, my last job, we had lots of this art on our walls. But it really boils down to beyond art. How do we use this in conservation at the Nature Conservancy and with our partners? Well, we use it in several ways. You use Landsat satellite. That's a body of satellites that we put up at the U.S. government that takes images like this one right in our own backyard. So there's Lake St. Clair, Detroit River, Western Lake Erie. And we can stitch those together and do land use and land cover. And we can stitch them together at ever larger scales and get land use and land cover at any point in time and over periods of time to see how it's changed. Okay. We can use sonar and radar to map bathymetry to see, you know, we often think of the Great Lakes as big blue blobs. They're not anything close to a big blue blob. This is the first rendition of the geoforms of the Great Lakes, and you can see there's a lot of diversity in depths out there, a lot of diversity in habitats, and we're using this information to create a classification of ecological habitat types across the Great Lakes. Okay? These satellites can even measure some other amazing things like Western Lake Erie. They can distinguish between good forms of algae and bad forms of algae like microcystis, which lead to harmful algal blooms, which you can see here in green versus blue in Western Lake Erie. All the green and light blue hues are different forms of algae. And you can actually see it here in Rochester, New York, where they're trying to stay ahead of the curve, so to speak, on harmful algal blooms. And all this near shore, the dark patches, those are microcystis algal blooms starting. And they can use that then to go out and help and be proactive to eradicate them before they become too big of a problem. Another critical form of technology is the one that we all know and love, GPS systems, right? There's 24 satellites that orbit the Earth at any given time. Like right now, there's 4 of them looking down on you that can give you a very precise location. All right? So there's always 4 of them looking at you. And what this has done is it's revolutionized our ability to collect data. Okay? A very important piece of data, and that is location. We have the same mantra in conservation as real estate agents do. Location, 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 right? 90% of what we do is tied to a place. So in terms of priorities, where to work. So the data we collect can't just be where someone goes, well, where's that data from? If I can't answer that, then it's pretty much useless to me in most instances, okay? So with all of this, remote sensing, GPS technologies, what it did is changed our perspective, fundamentally changed how we could see the world, how we could analyze these complex systems, and it spawned a whole new discipline, the discipline of landscape ecology, because with remote sensing, we could see things like patches, distinct patches, right? Identify corridors, mosaics of diverse habitats. And it started with Foreman and Godwin's book back, gosh, when was it? Mid-80s. And now you have all these journals, all these publications that have come out around it, and we use it extensively in our conservation planning efforts. But on the heels of it, data's only good if you can analyze it really well. And so the next thing I want to talk about is geographic information systems. And 2 pioneering people. So a GIS, how many people have heard of a GIS? Oh, fantastic, most of you have, so I'm speaking to the choir. But it's just a computer mapping system that changed the world, right? And it totally revolutionized conservation planning. It took it to a new level. And it was started by this guy here, Roger Tomlinson, who created the Canada GIS, okay, in 1968. But then this guy, Jack Dangermond, started with his wife Laura in 1969, ESRI, Environmental Systems Research Institute. And this is one of those stories of marketing is very important, okay? Because today, Canada GIS is dead, even though early practitioners said it was way better than the ESRI products of ArcGIS. But ArcGIS is pretty much a monopoly. Okay? But what it allows you to do is it allows you to integrate all of these different pieces of information and identify patterns, establish relationships, and it's used extensively in city planning, but also in conservation planning. Right? And think about what this did in terms of revolutionizing things. Okay? So you have Clarence King and John Wesley Powell, okay, the first and second directors of the U.S. Geological Survey, who begged Congress back in the late 1879 to create the U.S. Geological Survey and said, we need maps. Location is important of all our natural resources so that we can go from these early settlers maps to maps like this today, which are actually based on the original surveys of these folks. It's amazing what they were able to do with a survey scope, a plane table, a plumb bob. But can you imagine what they would think about what we're doing today in terms of our mapping? Okay, and what it allows us to do, more specifically, GIS allows us to map the distributions and analyze relationships for the things we care about, species, communities, and habitats. Okay, here's the collections, spawning locations for yellow perch, very valuable fish, sport fish. Here's something that a couple of our scientists, Mary Corey and Matt Herbert, did. It's an analysis of prioritization of migratory fish spawning habitat in the Great Lakes. Okay, But it was so important to us mapping that. TNC started the heritage programs. A lot of people familiar with the heritage programs that we started back in the 70s, and it's now NatureServe and NatureServe Explorer. It's data on species and community types, right? But it also allows us to map human activities and values, like this product that we developed recently in terms of identifying the human footprint in terms of our freshwater waterways, or this one that was developed by John Allen, or Dave Allen, I'm sorry, at University of Michigan, and three of our scientists were part of the team, is a cumulative stress map of the Great Lakes. And then lastly, our conservation priorities, a map I showed earlier of our portfolio sites, and some of our conservation actions like protected lands, but also many others. So, more importantly, I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, integrating technologies. It's not so much those technologies in isolation, it's how they're integrated is really where we start to see the benefits of them. And so, going way back when I was talking about tracking animals' movements, now, what you can do, unfortunately, the animal has to be quite big, but you can put a GPS unit on the back of bigger animals like a loggerhead turtle. And you can go on to seaturtle.org right now, and you can log in and track the movements of 16 different turtles on a daily basis. That's pretty amazing. So satellites are sitting here tracking the locations of these turtles, and we're using it to gather habitat information to help conserve these wonderful creatures. Here's the ultimate of integration. Only due to massive storage in the cloud, these huge decks of servers, processing speeds, all of the satellite technology and the internet, this just came out recently, and this is the first ever stitching together of global forest change. All the green, red, and blue you see here is the forest of the world. Scientists from around the world are sharing their data in the cloud via the internet, stitching it together and measuring forest loss in the red, forest gained, you can't even really see the blue, some blue down here, and where forests are stable. This is giving us a whole new ability to account for changes in forest habitat, or any habitat for that matter, at a scale, unprecedented scale. Computer modeling. This is the ultimate of integrations, particularly geospatial modeling I'm going to talk about. The purpose here, computer models, is to identify patterns, relationships, and predict the future, right? If we didn't have computer models, we'd be still doing it by hand. That really, models is nothing but mathematical formulas, right? Okay, we all aspire to have that crystal ball, though. There's too many models and too many advancements to talk about, but the primary ones we use in conservation pertain to weather and climate, hydrology, water quality, and species models. And what I want to talk about here is, with these models, if you remember back to early December when you were wanting snow for Christmas, these models actually allowed you to go online and predict who would likely have a white Christmas, all right? Or we can look even further into the future and say, what would Michigan's climate look like in 2050 or 2095? Well, it's going to be where I was for 18 years in Missouri, is what we're projecting. And let me tell you, the summers were pretty hot. Or we can predict flood flows in the Clinton River. This was a flood flow prediction recently for the Clinton River, which we're all kind of nervous about floods right now. Or we can predict the future distribution of an important native species, the brook trout, across the Great Lakes, or at least Michigan and Wisconsin and Minnesota. Okay? I'm going to plant a seed. Mary Fales is in the audience, and she's going to be talking here next month. And I'm going to talk about a tool that blows my mind. I can barely scratch the surface of this, okay? It's called the Soil and Water Assessment Tool. But this, I just want to talk about for 1 second, because if you sit and think about, and this is just one example of many that do this. Here's the natural processes: hydrology, weather, soil processes that determine water quality and flows in a particular stream, right? You have evaporation, soil evaporation, water evaporation, rainfall, snowfall, through flow, exfiltration, groundwater, recharge, deep percolation. This model does it all. But to do it, it has to integrate all these different layers in order to, just like before, it can predict daily into the future what the water quality and flows will likely be. But how we're using it is we can predict water quality at any given day across many locations. And this map shows which particular water quality variables are likely limiting the fish community at all these places simultaneously. That blows my mind. But it's a very powerful tool. Mechanical, all the engineering fields, how do we use them? Well, these are the on-the-ground conservation actions. Again, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these practices pertaining to water, like fish passage systems, agriculture, like no-till planters, or urban. There's literally, EPA has 2 documents out. It's called 101 Urban Best Management Practices, and the other one is another 101 Urban Best Management Practices, and they're like this thick, for things like permeable concrete to reduce runoff, etc. But all of these things are used as part of our toolbox to improve conservation of natural systems. And then buried down there, due to a technological thing, snafu, is communications and information systems. And everyone knows, who's this guy? Maxwell Smart, yes. The old, and what's interesting, and this is actually funny, this is a real system. This was developed by the Dutch in World War II to listen to enemy planes on the beaches. And there's several different systems they developed, but I thought that was just funny. But when I asked, I sent an email out to a bunch of my colleagues across the Great Lakes and beyond and said, send me your top 3 technological advancements I've given a talk. And I was amazed at how many people sent in and said communications and information systems. And you know why? It struck me is that telecommunications allows us to communicate with almost anyone, anywhere. All right, we've all seen this. We take this for granted. I love this shot. This is a palm tree hiding a cell phone tower in the Florida Keys. But we take it for granted, the cell phone coverage that we have here. But what it's done is, here's our David Banks, our program director for our Africa program. They have the Northern Rangelands project, which allows them to actually communicate with the Maasai, a semi-nomadic tribe that does cattle ranching, in order to protect core habitat areas for a variety of wildlife, but also the migration corridors. They're on cell phones constantly, and they can communicate with them. But the other thing is, this was revealing to me, is several people said, well, with the internet and these telecommunications, it's allowed us to scale up our conservation actions. These blueprints, these are conservation plans, the first of their kind for the actual individual Great Lakes. We have all these partners we have to work with, and we held tons of WebEx conferences. For each of these lakes, we had over 200 individuals representing generally 50 to 75 different partners to come together and develop a common plan for conservation of these lakes. We could have never done that before. We would have still been doing site planning because we can't communicate at the scale at which we want to do conservation. Okay? So there's all the different communications we use. Now here's the cautionary tale. And I live and breathe this, okay? There are so many things to measure, and there's so many technological gadgets. And I will be the first to admit technology has played a critical role in conservation. And advancements can fundamentally, and have, as I just showed, fundamentally changed our conservation strategies. However, there has to be a clear distinction of having technology drive your conservation strategies versus having conservation strategies drive the practical application of technology. And that's what we do at TNC, okay? We've got to be aware of the shiny object syndrome so that we don't become a slave to technology, okay? And how we do this is we're very true. Our state director, Helen, is here, Helen Taylor, and she's always, vertical alignment. We're one conservancy. We have to live that mantra, and it's about protecting nature and preserving life. Our mission is to conserve the lands and waters upon which all life depends, okay? Our vision is a sustainable world for future generations. And we have a specific, in the Great Lakes here, we have what's called the Great Lakes Project. And our objective here, and I think Helen coined this, and I think it's appropriate, is to ensure that the Great Lakes watershed is among the most effectively managed ecosystem on Earth. That's a valiant charge, and we're trying to live and breathe it. And how we do that is we have 5 conservation strategies, okay? Aquatic invasive species, watersheds, coastal systems, native fisheries, and northern forests. And I'm going to do a little bit of a deeper dive on these 3 to show you specifically some examples of how we're using technology in those strategies to advance our conservation. Okay? Starting with invasive species. Surveillance, we do 3 things: surveillance, modeling and mapping, and response, where we're using technology to ensure that our conservation actions are more effective. eDNA, environmental DNA sampling, to help us detect Asian carp, silver carp, bighead carp, which we developed in conjunction with the University of Notre Dame. Okay? We have all these surveillance locations where we can go out there and detect the likely presence of these invasive species. We can also go beyond our borders and actually identify potential future habitat for things that have yet to enter the Great Lakes but have a high probability of coming here, like the killer shrimp. This is some mapping and modeling some of my staff are doing, again, in conjunction with Notre Dame, to predict the likely distribution of this little fella. He looks innocent enough. He's not. He will eat our native shrimp in the Great Lakes that are the basis of our food chain. So we don't want that critter here if we can avoid it. And then Matt Herbert, if you came to the talk last month, Matt Herbert talked about the testing of this seismic gun to control some existing invasive species like rusty crayfish and round goby, which have infested spawning reefs throughout the Great Lakes and are impacting some of our native fisheries, fishes like lake trout and lake whitefish. Unfortunately, it didn't prove useful or effective at controlling these species, but it has proven effective on other species. It's mainly a gas bladder issue. Mary Fales, as I said, is going to be talking about our work in the watershed agricultural component of our watershed strategy. And I referenced this earlier, our SWAT model, but more specifically, what the SWAT model has allowed us to do is establish relationships between fish community health and water quality, and so that we can identify, as I referenced earlier, where fish communities are limited across this region, what parameters, what actual habitat conditions are limiting the fish community, and we can use it to actually set realistic goals, and that's what Mary with our partners, and then strategically achieve those goals. Okay, she's also going to be talking about how we're using information management technologies, like to develop conjunction with Michigan State University Institute for Water Research, the Great Lakes Watershed Management System, that allows us to strategically target best management practices, but also track their cumulative benefit towards those goals. Okay? And then we're using innovative conservation practices like the 2-stage ditch, which is a new way where we can actually get a semblance of a floodplain on some of these highly channelized streams in these ditched areas throughout the Great Lakes. And that way, floodplains can do their work, which is absorb, transform, uptake all of those nutrients and sediments and prevent them from getting in our waterways in the first place. Okay, here's a new project that we just started with the Great Lakes Protection Fund, which is building on that. One of the things farmers do in the Great Lakes, in these really flat areas, these dark areas, are where farmers put in drain tiles. Okay, if you have a crop out there, right, corn, you have a lot of rain and it floods, what happens to the corn? It's going to die, right? It's a lost crop. So what they do is they put in these drain tile systems, and it allows them to manage water levels. Well, that's good for them, not always so good for the streams. So one of the things we're doing is we have these ways of managing water flow, regulating the water flow, but right now most of them are manual. The farmer actually has to go out there and turn it. But what we can do is put remote devices on there, and a farmer can be on his iPad and actually literally control it. But more importantly, now we're applying swarm technology. Anyone hear of swarm technology? You know how birds synchronize their flight in flocks, or fish synchronize their swimming? We can have these things integrated in a manner that minimizes nutrient or water quality impacts and flow impacts simultaneously across a large geography. Again, that's beyond my mind, but Our coastal system, the stopover habitat, data collection techniques. This is a radar image, and we want to prioritize where these critters come in and land. We use Doppler radar to identify these red areas where you have tons of birds coming into land. They generally migrate at night, so you can't really see them come into land, but we can use Doppler radar. We also use eBird data. This is where citizens have participated in helping us become better conservationists. These dark areas, each of these cells, you can go online if you're a birder, and you can observe your birds and become a registered eBird participant and share your data with this platform, and then we can use it to help guide our conservation efforts and prioritize these areas like around Point Pele that you see over here in Western Lake Erie, and then we use it in our online mapping applications, which we call the Stopover Portal, that scientists are now using and conservationists using to prioritize conservation work in these coastal systems of the Great Lakes. We also are using engineering technologies for wetland restoration for our coastal strategy, like the Marshmaster. Phragmites, everyone's here has heard about Phragmites, another invasive species, horrible. Very difficult to control, but the efficiencies, we've just got this Marshmaster, we can take it out to Erie Marsh and cut huge swaths of this down, much more efficiently than hand pulling or herbicides, whatnot. But we're also using another technology. A lot of our wetlands, coastal wetland habitats in the Great Lakes, were once used by spawning, coastal wetland spawning fish species like northern pike or even perch, but they've been blocked off, diked off from the Great Lakes themselves. But what we've done is put in and are putting in technologies of controlling water flow passively between these different wetland systems. So with that, deep breath, almost at the end. There's a lot of technology we're using. I hope I'm making that point clear. What's the next frontier? Well, I'm going to talk about two things. The next and last frontier, maybe. It's integrated planning. This is as according to Scott Sowa, integrated planning for nature and people. We've done a lot of really great planning, conservation planning, to guide where we work and how we work for the benefit of nature. Okay, and we compile all these different data layers. This is for Western Lake Erie, and we can integrate these layers to say, where do we optimize and maximize our return on investment with our limited resources to benefit the greatest breadth of biodiversity? Okay, well, now we're being asked, or we're asking ourselves, what if we bring in the values of humans, how they interact with nature, how they benefit from nature, how they use it for fishing, or how they benefit from clean water, etc. And so we can actually compile social data and use sophisticated conservation planning programs like Marksan that does cost-benefit analyses, and we're right in the mix of this right now, and we have these different layers for nature and people, and we just completed the first iteration of prioritization based on nature. We have to do it for people and then integrate the two and see where we can find win-wins, or win-win-win-win-win-wins. That's our goal, okay? The second great next frontier as I see it, again according to Scott, is landscape scale collaboration. I talked about earlier these planning efforts where Doug Pearsall and others led, where we had 200 individuals plus doing these lake basin planning efforts, okay, in order to help us work at these large scales. But plans are just plans, right? You could write a business plan. If you don't implement it, what good is it? So what we're actually thinking about is, who are the best people at implementing things at a landscape scale? It's these large global enterprises like Starbucks, McDonald's, Chryslers, Fords, GMs of the world, where they have millions of employees, millions of partners, suppliers, and they have to choreograph all of that activity so that I can go to any McDonald's of the 40,000 McDonald's in the world and get the same French fry. How do they do that? It's pretty amazing. Okay? This is a new frontier for us. We're trying to work at larger and larger scales, and so what we've developed is the Great Lakes Information Management and Delivery System. So how they actually do that, how business and industry does that, is they create information supply chains to support their material supply chains. We've never had one of those in conservation. We're leading the development of the Great Lakes IMDS to get the right information to the right people in the right format at the right time to support the logistics of landscape scale conservation, and that includes you. There's information in here for you to become a participant in conservation, okay? And with that, I'm going to return to my cautionary tale, and I hope I'm not beating a dead horse, but it is important because I believe it. I believe we live it day in and day out. But I love this cartoon. I modified it extensively, but I just found it funny, you know, habitat conditions declining. He says, before we give our strategy our full and undivided attention, check out this shiny new thing I just found. But it's true. We recognize it's not about the shiny new thing. It's about these places, right? At the end of the day, it's about these places, and it's about the strategies and where technology fits and it makes sense to help us do better at securing these places for people and nature in the future. That's what happens at the end of the day. And so with that, I will gladly take any questions, but I want to remind people that you are invited to see our very own Mary Fales on March 20th, who's in the audience, and then Chris May on April 24th. And I also invite you to please join us by visiting any one of our websites or join us on Facebook. And with that, I'll gladly entertain any questions. And I understand with the weather and stuff, if some of you want to head out, feel free. I'll be sticking around for quite a while to take questions. So, yeah.
I have a question about Phragmites and mapping. What's being done about Phragmites and how do you map it and Phragmites?
Yeah. So there's the invasive species. What's the acronym for it? So there's the Invasive Species Monitoring Network. Sean Howard and Chris May are the ones that are leading our efforts in terms of control of invasives. And Sean Howard is leading the control of invasives all up and down for us in partnership with Helen, help me out here. The Dune Alliance. Yeah, up and down eastern Lake Michigan. But in terms of Phragmites, there is the Invasive Species Monitoring Network. Right. Are you asking more specific?
I was wondering how you actually do it and where you do it.
Or
do you do it, or does somebody else do it?
No, we do it on our preserves, okay? But that's the only place where we do it. We help control invasives, other invasives, like baby's breath, in eastern Lake Michigan outside of our preserves in conjunction with the Dune Alliance. But as far as I know, Phragmites control we only do on our preserves. Is that correct?
We actually, some invasives can be eradicated if we get there early enough. But
right.
When it comes to Phragmites, you have to choose your battles.
Yeah.
So prioritizing on public and private lands where you need to see restoration of coastal wetlands, et cetera. So we're never going to get rid of that thing. It's
no.
Really it's an issue of triage and how to effectively protect the most priority habitats.
Yeah.
I guess I was wondering, is anything being done at a statewide level other than?
Not for Phragmite. Like Helen said, it's so pervasive. Most invasive species, it is a triage, except for we've successfully, for the most part, eradicated baby's breath from almost all of eastern Lake Michigan now, which is one of the, I mean, at a landscape scale, that's unprecedented. But something like Phragmites, it's going to be just at targeted areas to control it so that and what we do is we have to be clear about what the habitat conditions we're trying to restore at those locations and whether or not we use mechanical, chemical, or other means. So, yeah.
Phragmites on the local level, there's a group called Open Phragmites Invasive Species. I'm not familiar with the task force, OPUS task force, and we'll look it up. There's a website and a Facebook page on the Facebook administrator for that group. And they meet monthly, and they're working on helping the small things on the most local level. So subdivisions and municipalities addressing it out there for specific properties that are nature areas or in the parks. It's kind of a lost cause when it comes to the ditches from the road commission, but sometimes those are of concern because of visibility issues or they're not spreading it. So that's part of the mission of that on a local level, is to make people aware. And next week in Oregon, we're having a meeting for homeowners association and addressing specifically Phragmites in retention ponds in homeowners associations. You know, any little bit that we can do to get added and educate the public, whatever way. Because we're talking at that level because we're not preaching to the choir. People in this room know about arthritis. But your typical homeowners associations don't realize they think that's a wetland and they're supposed to do nothing with it. And so we're trying to say, hey, wait a second, there's a few times when we need to go in there and do something.
Anyone else? Hey,
Yeah,
hey, Bob.
so I have a question on your information system, the one you just showed last.
Yeah.
So who are the users of that system? Is it just the scientists?
No, it's actually built, I can say this because I'm a scientist. We have catered to scientists for far too long in conservation, natural resource conservation. This is actually built more for the resource managers, legislators, and agency administrators, okay? Because we're trying to get the right information to them so that they can strategically allocate resources, money, people, supplies to support conservation. We don't necessarily need more science to do much better conservation. We always need more science to advance our knowledge, but the state of our knowledge right now is being underutilized because we're not meeting the needs of the leaders.
Does it also target the individual businesses like engineering firms?
It can't. Well, it's funny you mention that because and I could spend a lot of time on this, but it follows the mentality of large global enterprises where they have individual information supply chains for each product line. So if you go to a Myers, they have a information supply chain for the cosmetics, for the groceries, because you have these linked chain of people and jobs and resources. And we do the same thing, so it's built out issue by issue. And the first thing that we're doing is connectivity, restoring tributary connectivity throughout the Great Lakes. There's estimated about 150,000 barriers in the Great Lakes, blocking migratory fish movement and impairing our fisheries. And so part of the IMDS is strategically targeting engineering firms that are in the business of culvert replacement or fish passage. So, does that answer your question? Yeah.
Yes.
Any other questions? And feel free to, I'll be sticking around, so feel free to ask questions. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Hi.